October 12, 2011, 2300 hours eastern edge of the Nevada Test and Training Range. Our trucks faced the white line we were not permitted to cross. I was team lead, third shift, eyes on the flats. The first thump came soft like a hand on a distant door. I marked it in my log, 123. The generator breathed behind me. JP8 and hot dust sat in my nose. The sky was black and clean. The ground was pale and empty. Range control had gone quiet for the night. That was normal here. The only rule that mattered was simple: do not cross. Not for lights, not for noise, not for curiosity. Another thump, same distance. I took 3 slow breaths and checked the boundary stakes again. A faint dust smear rose beyond a low ridge. No wind, no traffic, just that dust holding still where it should not. I clicked my pen, looked at the line, and waited for the next order. Before we start the video, hit the subscribe button to support the channel. It only takes a second. I was assigned to a joint detachment from the Army's Test Support Group. We were stationed north of Indian Springs, near the edge of the Nevada Test and Training Range. The desert out there is endless, flat as a table and carved with small, dry washes that twist between low ridges. You learn to respect silence there. It hides everything. Our job was simple on paper. We supported recovery when training debris or drones landed outside the range. If anything crossed the boundary, we moved fast to secure it before civilians found it. Inside the line, it was none of our concern. The Air Force handled that. I had been there 3 months when this story happened. The days were dry, wind carried a taste of iron, and the nights dropped below freezing. Most of the time, we just watched stars and logged coordinates. Sometimes jets screamed overhead during red flag training, but our area stayed quiet. The restricted box west of us, labeled R4808 November on the map, was marked off limits to all of us. That was the zone nobody entered without high clearance. The boundary itself wasn't dramatic. A dirt track, a few white posts, a faint line on the GPS. That was it. Still, every man in our team treated that line like a cliff. Command made sure we understood the cost of stepping over. If you crossed, you lost your post, and your record carried a mark you'd never erase. The desert has its own rhythm. By day, the wind whips heat and sand through your teeth. By night, the cold cuts deep. Machines make a sound like breathing when they cool down. You start hearing your own pulse through the headset. Some of the men joked that the ground itself listened. I stopped laughing after my second week. Our team worked 4 soldiers and 1 civilian range tech. We rotated night watches in 6-hour blocks. My truck carried radio, GPS, and recovery gear for small debris. The generator burned JP8 and gave off that sharp, oily smell that never leaves your clothes. We'd learned to keep distance from it when the wind turned. The night of October 12th was routine until that thump. Earlier that evening, range control told us red flag flights had ended. The airspace went cold at 2100. The rule after shutdown was strict. If anything happened past that hour, it wasn't part of the exercise. We logged and reported. Nothing more. One of the men, Specialist Hart, had been tracking signals earlier. He mentioned a data drone that lost link over Sector Delta 29. Command marked it as contained inside range limits. No action for us. That was 6 hours before the first thump. The sound didn't fit the usual pattern. Not an impact, not artillery, not aircraft. More like pressure equalizing far away. I could feel it under my boots, but faint. Not enough to shake the dirt. The radio stayed quiet. No call-outs from range control. That silence bothered me more than the sound itself. I wrote the time in my logbook, 23:02 hours. I used a 3 count, my habit since deployment. It helped me stay calm, measure distance, keep rhythm. 3 heartbeats, 3 steps, 3 breaths. The generator coughed once. The smell thickened. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a red light blinked once, then faded. Hart asked if I saw it. I said yes, but told him not to mark it. We had no clearance to look west beyond the line. Our orders never changed. Observe, report. Do not interfere. Still, the longer I watched that ridge, the more I felt something had shifted. The desert looked the same, but the silence was wrong, heavier. I could sense motion, though nothing moved. It felt like the air waited for us to act. The edge of the range sits like a forgotten border. No fence, no lights, just emptiness. A dirt road called Groom Lake Road ran near our post, heading straight west toward the restricted box. At night, the road looked endless. The map showed it as open terrain, but every soldier knew how close it came to the red zone. Our command post was a small trailer cluster beside a dry basin. A single antenna and a generator kept us connected. We shared the airspace with the Air Force, so most orders came through range control. They were calm and exact. No details, only coordinates and status codes. That was how things worked. Need to know stayed locked down. Every morning, a convoy of white buses passed on the far highway. No markings, tinted windows. Locals said they carried contractors to the test sites. We never looked long. Orders said to keep our distance. The same buses came back after sunset. They followed the same route every day. No exceptions. Inside the range, activity shifted week to week. Sometimes red flag flights filled the night sky. Flares dropped, jets curved overhead, and we listened to coded chatter on open bands. The sound of those engines carried far in the desert. Other times, silence stretched for days. No aircraft, no lights, nothing but heat waves. On the ground, we checked our maps daily. The range limits changed often for safety. One day the boundary could move half a mile east, then return again. That made everyone uneasy. You could step into the wrong zone without realizing it. Command drilled that into us. Always confirm, never assume. We trained for recovery work with strict steps. If wreckage fell outside, we secured it, took photos, logged time and position, and waited for a clearance team. If it fell inside, we called it in and stood down. It didn't matter how close it was to the line. Inside meant sealed. I learned early not to ask what the Air Force tested. Rumors filled the barracks. Talk about new aircraft or energy systems. I ignored it. The truth never reached us, and guessing only made shifts longer. Still, you could tell when something serious was underway. Security doubled. Patrols appeared from nowhere and radios went silent. The night of October 12th had that same tension. No warning, no change on the schedule, but everyone felt it. Even the generator sounded different, like it was straining. The smell of JP-8 clung heavier in the air, mixed with desert dust. Hart joked about static in the air. Nobody laughed. Our orders stayed the same: hold position, monitor the eastern grid, confirm nothing crosses the boundary. I checked the maps twice. The restricted zone was stable, marked by a thin red shape on the tablet. Our line was clear. Then just before 2300, range control cut one frequency and left only a backup open. That was rare. The message was short. Routine maintenance window. Maintain listening silence until further notice. We all knew what that meant. Something was happening inside the box. The desert went still. No wind, no sound, only the hum of our generator and the slow rhythm of my 3 count. 1, 2, 3, breathe, wait, watch. Then came the thump. Soft, deep, distant. Not enough to shake gear, but enough to feel through the soles. The dust lifted off the ridge again. That was when I realized we might not be alone out there. The second thump came 5 minutes after midnight. Same direction, same tone, like something hollow shifting deep underground. I wrote the time in my log and underlined it. Hart stood by the truck with the binoculars raised but didn't speak. The light on his wristwatch blinked once, then went dark. We were used to noise in the desert. Jets, drones, target impacts. Nothing about this sound fit those patterns. It had no echo, no follow-through, just a short pulse, then silence. Our radio stayed on standby. Range control hadn't lifted the quiet order. That meant no chatter, no reports, unless it was an emergency. I looked west toward the ridge. A dust plume still hung there, barely visible against the stars. It didn't move. The wind had died. I walked 20 yards along the boundary markers, flashlight off. The cold bit through my gloves. The dirt crunched under my boots. I counted my steps in threes to steady my nerves. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Halfway down the line, I found a marker lying flat. I pushed it back upright. It wasn't broken, just loose, as if the ground had trembled. I pressed the soil, still warm. That shouldn't have been possible in the cold. Hart called out softly, asking if I saw movement. I told him no, but I wasn't sure. A faint glimmer had flashed near the wash. Maybe a reflection. Nothing steady, nothing shaped. At 30, the sound came again, shorter this time, like a door sealing shut. The generator coughed, then steadied. The air smelled thick with burned metal, a tang that overpowered the JP-8 for a moment. I picked up the radio handset but didn't transmit. The silence order was still active. I hated that rule. It kept you guessing, trapped with your thoughts. Every second felt stretched. I checked the GPS. The ridge was less than a mile past the line inside the restricted box. If something had come down there, we couldn't move on it. If debris crossed out, we'd be the first to reach it. That was our purpose. But the map showed nothing new. No beacon, no ping. At 100, a white light flickered across the valley floor. Not steady, more like lightning without thunder. It lit the sand for a split second, then vanished. Hart saw it too. We both looked at the clock. 1, 2, 3. I logged it. Light event. West Ridge. No movement. Observed. That was all I could write without breaking protocol. A few minutes later, the desert grew bright again. This time from the east. Headlights. A convoy. 3 vehicles, no markings, moving along the inside track parallel to our line. Civilian models, white, without military plates. They stopped near the ridge. Doors opened. I saw small red lamps, the kind used to protect night vision. Then everything went dark again. I knew what that meant. Contractors, recovery, or test personnel. They worked quiet, fast, and always after hours. We were told to stay clear when they operated. Still, the timing was off. They shouldn't have been there during a communication blackout. I glanced at Hart. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We both knew the rule. If it's inside, it's theirs. The smell changed again, sharper, almost chemical. It mixed with dust and made the back of my throat itch. I swallowed hard and wiped my nose with my sleeve. By 1:30, the lights were gone. The desert went black again. Only the hum of our generator filled the air. I sat on the tailgate and tried to focus on my log book. My handwriting looked shaky. I marked another 3 count. 1, 2, 3. Then the radio cracked once. Faint static. No words, it clicked off by itself. Something had disrupted the channel. Hart looked at me. Interference, he asked quietly. I nodded, maybe. He didn't answer. We both knew interference didn't happen here unless something powerful was running nearby. The ridge stayed dark. The air stayed heavy. My chest felt tight, not from fear, but from the sense that something had changed in the ground itself. The next thump came softer, almost gentle, like a warning under the sand. By 200 hours, the radio came back to life. One short burst, then a voice. Range control. The tone was steady, calm, and distant. Hold position until further notice. Possible recovery operation in progress. That was all they said. Hart and I looked at each other. Recovery meant something had landed or fallen, and that it was still inside the restricted zone. We weren't supposed to move unless told. Still, I unfolded the map and traced the boundary with my finger. The ridge sat less than a mile away. The line between our ground and theirs was thin enough to disappear under a boot heel. Then came the wind. It arrived fast and carried a smell I didn't know. Metallic and sharp like burned circuits. The sand whipped against the truck doors, fine and dry. The sound of the thump was gone now, but the air hummed faintly. At 2:30, the light appeared again, this time closer. Maybe 3/4 of a mile. A pale white glow low to the ground, steady for a few seconds, then fading. Not a flare, not headlights. I logged the time and direction. Hart asked if we should call it in. I reminded him of the order, hold position. No movement, he didn't argue. We watched the glow vanish behind the ridge, then silence again. Something about that quiet felt wrong. Usually when recovery teams moved in, you could hear engines, voices, or even rotor noise from a helicopter. Tonight, nothing. Just the wind and that low hum in the air. I stepped away from the truck and checked the GPS. Our coordinates hadn't changed. The map still marked us outside the restricted area. The ridge remained red. But on the tablet, a new shaded zone blinked near its edge. It hadn't been there before. It looked like an expansion of the range by maybe half a mile west. I didn't know if that was an update or a glitch. I radioed a quick status check. No reply. At 300, headlights flashed behind us. A white pickup rolled down the dirt track. No unit markings, no number plate. It stopped about 50 yards from our post. The driver didn't step out. The lights went off, but the engine kept running. Hart muttered, "That's not one of ours." I watched through the side mirror. The truck sat still, engine low, no movement inside. After a minute, it reversed, turned back toward the main road and disappeared. No lights on the way out. We stood in silence. I kept my eyes on the ridge. I could still smell the burned metal scent every time the wind shifted. Around 3:30, a faint tone came through the radio. 3 short beeps, then static. That tone meant standby confirmation, but no one followed it with words. The hum in the air dropped off. The generator sounded clearer again. Hart leaned against the truck, eyes half closed. Then for a split second, a flash of orange lit the ridge. Not bright enough to blind, just a sharp glow, followed by another plume of dust. I grabbed my binoculars. The dust rose slow, almost straight up, and stopped halfway like it hit an invisible layer. Hart whispered, "That's outside the boundary, right?" I checked the GPS. According to our screen, the coordinates of that ridge sat 1,200 meters inside the restricted box, but the dust line on the horizon looked closer. The desert played tricks on distance, but this was different. I could feel it in my gut. We called range control again. This time the radio answered with 2 words, negative movement, then silence. That was all we were getting. By 400, the wind stopped again. The smell faded. The stars looked clearer than before. For a while, I thought the night was over. Then the generator coughed and died. Total dark. No sound except the ticking of cooling metal. Hart reached for the flashlight, but I stopped him. Wait. Out beyond the ridge, something reflected the starlight. Not steady, not glowing, just a shape. Small. Maybe 6 or 7 feet long. Smooth. Lying half hidden in the sand. It didn't move, but the air shimmered above it like heat. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. We had seen something that shouldn't exist outside a testing hangar. By 4:15, the shape hadn't moved. The generator was still down, and the only light came from the stars. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt something watching from the ridge. The desert was too still. No insects, no breeze, no engine sounds. I decided to call it in again. The radio clicked once, then connected. A calm voice answered. Not our usual controller. Hold your position. Civilian team inbound. Do not advance beyond your boundary. Safety perimeter active. That phrase, safety perimeter active, wasn't one I had ever heard before. It meant the restricted area had changed. The voice didn't explain how far. Hart looked at the ridge and then at me. You think it's inside now? I nodded, probably. He said nothing else. I powered the GPS again. The map refreshed and the red line had moved east by half a mile. The ridge, the wash, and the shape were now inside the new zone. We were ordered to stand down. That was it. Still, the air felt heavier. I could smell that same metallic scent mixed with dust. It reminded me of the time a power line snapped near base. Ozone and hot copper. The hairs on my arm stood up. At 4:30, headlights appeared far to the west. A convoy, 2 trucks and a flatbed trailer, all unmarked, rolling slow along the inner track. They stopped near the ridge close to where the object lay. A few figures stepped out, their silhouettes sharp under red headlamps. I counted them. 3. Then 3 more joined from the second truck. 6 total. They moved with purpose. No talking, no hesitation. One carried what looked like a handheld meter. Another unfolded a frame, maybe for lifting or scanning. I couldn't tell. Hart whispered, "We're not supposed to record this." I closed my logbook. We're not supposed to see it. The air hummed again, faint but steady. The men worked around the object, their red lights blinking in rhythm. Every few minutes, one of them would raise his hand toward the ridge, signaling something unseen. Then they'd pause, adjust their gear, and continue. At 4:50, range control called back. Same calm voice. Update. Maintain watch. Do not transmit or move until clearance confirmed. A safety boundary is in effect. You are now in outer perimeter. Outer perimeter meant we were part of containment, not observation. That was new. I looked at Hart. He shook his head, confused. We stood by the truck, waiting for a sign the recovery was over. I thought it would end like every other night, quiet and forgettable. But then the red lights near the ridge went out, all 6 at once. I stared into the dark. For a moment I saw faint blue light leaking through the dust like the ground itself glowed. Then nothing. The hum stopped. The air went flat. A few minutes later our radio hissed. Perimeter hold confirmed. No further activity authorized. Remain in place until sunrise. That was the end of the transmission. We stood there in the cold, staring at an empty ridge that had just been reclassified inside the boundary. It felt like the desert had swallowed whatever had fallen. The trucks near the ridge stayed dark for nearly an hour. No lights, no sound, just their shapes outlined by starlight. Hart leaned on the tailgate, eyes fixed on the same spot. Nobody spoke. Then around 5:30, something unexpected broke the silence. A pair of headlights coming from the public road. That stretch was rarely used at night. It wasn't one of ours. The vehicle moved slow, maybe a local ranch truck. Hart frowned. They're heading straight toward the wash. I grabbed the binoculars. The pickup rolled past the last warning sign without stopping. The driver had no idea where the boundary started. I tried to raise range control, but the channel was dead again. Static, faint, and constant. I switched to backup frequency. Nothing. The man in the pickup parked about 100 yards from the ridge. He stepped out, looked around, and started walking toward the spot where the contractors had been. I could see his flashlight beam cut through the dust. Hart asked quietly, "We warned him." I hesitated. The rule was clear. No movement inside the perimeter. But if he kept walking, he'd cross into a zone that might still be unsafe. I grabbed the loudhailer. "Stop, stay back." My voice carried across the flat ground, bouncing off the ridge. The man froze, turned toward our lights, and hesitated. He shouted something I couldn't hear. Hart switched on the truck's red beacons. The glow washed over the sand, revealing his outline. He shielded his eyes and started walking again, this time slower. "Stay where you are," I called again. Then a faint flicker of blue light shimmered near the ground behind him, right where the ridge began. The sand around his boots seemed to ripple, as if heat waves rose from beneath. He stopped again, confused. His flashlight dimmed, then cut out completely. I shouted one last time, "Back away now." He took 2 steps backward, then stumbled. The light faded completely. Hart ran for the radio, but I stopped him. The silence order was still active, and we didn't know if the field extended this far. One wrong transmission could draw attention we didn't want. After a moment, the man stood again. He turned toward his truck and limped back slowly, one hand gripping his side. When he reached the door, he looked back once more at the ridge. Then he climbed in and drove off without headlights. The sound of his engine faded into the distance. Hart exhaled, shaking his head. "He's lucky." I nodded, "Yeah." We stood there until the horizon started to glow faintly with morning light. The air had gone still again. No hum, no smell. The contractor trucks remained in place. No movement. At sunrise, a message came through, clear, direct, and final. Outer perimeter stand down. Await debrief. Civilian contact confirmed safe. No medical report required. End of transmission. That was all. No mention of the object. No mention of the blue light. Nothing. Hart sat on the truck step and rubbed his face. We're not writing this down, are we? I closed my logbook and slid it into my pocket. Command won't want it there. The ridge looked empty again, like nothing had happened. But the soil near the line had changed color. It looked darker, smoother, like it had melted and set again. I didn't mention it in the report. Some things you learn to leave off the page. When the wind came back, it carried the same faint metallic scent. I could still taste it hours later. That was when I knew this wasn't a normal test recovery. By 7 that morning, the desert light turned sharp and cold. The air shimmered above the sand and the ridge looked harmless again. The trucks from the night before were gone. No tire marks, no footprints, nothing but a faint patch of smooth dust where the object had been. I stood there staring at that spot, trying to convince myself it had all been routine. Hart was silent, packing the cables and folding the antenna. Then the radio cracked again, this time clear and formal. Bravo team, hold position. Security element approaching your grid. Prepare for handoff. That meant someone higher up was coming in to take over. I expected Air Force police, but what arrived wasn't standard. 3 tan Humvees rolled up the track with covered markings and dark windows. The men who stepped out wore clean uniforms without name tapes. They carried clipboards, not rifles. Their lead officer asked for my logbook. His tone was polite but cold. I handed it over without a word. He flipped through it quickly, tore out 2 pages, and gave the rest back. You'll receive an updated report form by mail, he said. I asked if we were cleared to leave. He said, not yet. They wanted us to hold until a civilian team inspected the ground. By noon, 2 white trucks arrived, the same type we had seen at night. The men wore gray coveralls and clear visors. They moved straight to the ridge and began setting up small tripods like survey tools. One knelt and scooped a handful of soil into a metal container. They didn't speak to us. The officer in charge told us to stay near our vehicles and keep visual logs only. The sun climbed higher. The ground baked under our boots. I could still smell that faint chemical sting in the air, even stronger now that the wind had stopped. My throat burned when I swallowed. Hart asked if I felt it too. I said yes. We both drank from our canteens, but it didn't help. At 1400 hours, one of the civilians walked toward us. He held a small scanner in his hand and pointed it at our generator. The display glowed green. He nodded once, said nothing, and walked away. I glanced at the officer, but he ignored us, watching the ridge. Minutes later, a low thump rolled across the basin. Not loud, not deep, just enough to shake the mirrors on our truck. I looked west. The ridge shifted under the light like a heat mirage. Then a quick flash, white and flat, cut across the ground and was gone. The civilian stopped moving. For a few seconds, everyone froze. Then the officer spoke quietly into his headset and waved us back. "Get behind your vehicle," he said. We obeyed. The air pressed heavy as if a storm had formed without clouds. The metallic smell hit harder now, sharp enough to sting my nose. Hart coughed and covered his mouth. A soft vibration pulsed through the dirt, slow and rhythmic. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded. When it stopped, the officer lowered his headset and exhaled like he had been holding his breath. "It's done," he said to no one in particular. The civilians packed their tools fast. One of them sealed the containers and loaded them into a truck. Another ran a handheld sprayer across the ground, leaving a thin film that shimmered in the sunlight. They did it methodically, square by square, like painting the sand. When finished, they marked the area with small yellow stakes and waved for us to stand down. I looked at the ridge one last time. The ground there looked smooth again, almost glassy. No debris, no tire prints, no proof that anything had ever been there. The officer gave a short nod. "You can go back to base now." His tone made it clear we weren't supposed to ask questions. We packed our gear in silence. Before leaving, I checked the GPS again. The red boundary line had returned to its original position. Whatever they had done, the restricted zone had shrunk back overnight. As we drove out, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. The ridge was fading into haze, but for a moment I thought I saw a faint reflection near the wash, like light bouncing off metal. I blinked and it was gone. I didn't tell Hart. Some things you let pass so they don't follow you later. We drove back toward base in silence. The desert stretched behind us like a blank sheet. No tracks, no trace of the night. The sun hung low over the mountains, washing everything in a dull orange haze. I tried to shake off the feeling that we had been standing beside something we weren't meant to see. Hart sat next to me, holding the radio handset, though there was nothing left to hear. Halfway to the highway, the signal returned. Range control came on crisp and official. Bravo team. Acknowledge clearance to return to facility. Equipment inspection required upon arrival. I confirmed, voice steady. My hands weren't. We reached the base around 1500 hours. The guard at the gate stopped us longer than usual. He checked the vehicle, then waved us toward a small hangar instead of the usual motor pool. Inside, 2 men waited with clipboards. They wore no rank insignia, only ID tags with a red stripe. One asked for our dosimeters and gloves. The other took our GPS unit. No explanation. We sat on folding chairs while they ran a detector over our boots and uniforms. The screen flashed green. One man nodded and handed back our badges. "You're clear," he said quietly. "Command will debrief you in 20 minutes. Hart looked pale. He asked if they had done that before. I told him never. The man at the table ignored us, writing in a small black notebook. When the debrief officer finally arrived, he carried himself like someone used to silence. He asked short questions. What we saw, what we logged if we crossed the boundary. I answered each one straight. When he asked if I made visual contact with any object, I paused before saying yes. His pen stopped. "Describe it." "Smooth," I said, "metallic, maybe about 6 or 7 feet long. No markings, no movement." He nodded once and kept writing. When I finished, he said, "You'll submit a brief written version, keep it factual. No assumptions, no descriptions you can't confirm." After that, we were dismissed. Hart and I walked out into the sunlight. The air still smelled faintly of fuel and dust. For the rest of that day, neither of us spoke much. That night I lay in my bunk and listened to the generator outside the barracks. The rhythm reminded me of those thumps in the desert. Same pause between beats, same low pulse you could feel through the floor. I counted again just to quiet my thoughts. 1, 2, 3, over and over. 2 days later, I got an envelope marked confidential. Inside was a typed summary of our mission. It said we had assisted in a range safety containment exercise. No mention of any object, no mention of civilians, no record of the new boundary. Just safety data and equipment inspection results. Hart came by that evening holding his copy. He laughed once without humor. "Containment exercise," he said. "Guess that's what they call it now." I didn't answer. My thoughts were back on the ridge, on the man in the pickup, on that blue shimmer in the dust. The image stuck with me like a shadow you can't step away from. Before lights out, I checked the radio out of habit. It was tuned to the same range control frequency. Dead air. Then faintly, 3 short beeps, the same tone we had heard before the silence. I sat still, waiting for a voice. None came. I turned the dial off and stared at the dark. The generator outside gave one slow thump, then another. The rhythm matched perfectly. I realized then that whatever we had stood near that night hadn't stayed buried out there. It stayed with us. A week passed before anyone mentioned the incident again. The desert returned to its routine. We rotated shifts, checked coordinates, logged hours, and acted like nothing had happened. But the silence felt different now, heavier. The sound of the generator still carried that deep pulse. and sometimes I caught myself counting to 3 without realizing it. The report came through official channels on the 8th day. Range perimeter event concluded. No recovery data outside restricted zones. No injuries. All personnel cleared for duty. That was it. 2 sentences for a night that had burned into memory. Hart kept quiet for most of that week. He stopped joining the others at the mess and spent nights in the vehicle bay tinkering with the radios. One evening, he handed me a note folded twice. Inside were 2 small readings from a handheld radiation counter. The numbers were low, nothing dangerous, but higher than baseline. He had taken them from the soil stuck on our boots. I told him to throw the paper away. He did, but I saw the doubt in his face. The base changed after that. Security checks grew tighter. Entry logs for the west perimeter were sealed. The usual civilian convoys didn't show for several days, and when they returned, their vehicles bore new company logos we didn't recognize. Every trace of what happened was being rewritten in real time. I filed my gear for inspection. The technician gave it back in a sealed bag labeled decontaminated. No explanation, just a routine note. The same bag carried the faint metallic smell that had followed us since that night. During our next range patrol, I drove past the same sector. The ridge looked smaller in daylight. A line of yellow stakes marked the old boundary, half buried in sand. The soil was darker there, still smoother than the rest of the ground. The GPS map showed nothing unusual, but the moment I stepped out, I could feel it. The silence was deeper. No wind, no insects, no hum of life. I walked 3 paces forward, stopped, and looked west. Beyond that invisible line, the world looked normal. But I knew better. Some things out there weren't part of our orders and never would be. When I got back to the truck, Hart asked if I saw anything. I said no. It was easier that way. That night I cleaned my boots for the 3rd time. The dust still carried that faint metallic taste. I thought about sending a private report but stopped myself. No one wanted this story written down. Not the Army, not the Air Force, not anyone tied to the range. In the end, I did what most soldiers do. I followed orders. I stayed silent, but silence has weight. Days turned into months. The ridge stayed empty, but the feeling never left. Every time the generator pulsed, I heard that buried thump. Every time the wind shifted, I caught that same metallic scent. Hart transferred out before winter. He didn't say goodbye. His bunk stayed untouched for weeks. Then someone new took it. Our team got new maps soon after. The boundary near the ridge was redrawn again, farther east, officially for environmental safety. Nobody questioned it. One evening, I stood alone outside the barracks. The desert stretched dark and endless. A low echo drifted from the west, faint and steady. 3 short beats, then silence. I knew the sound. I didn't write it down. Some things you log once and never speak of again. Years have passed since that night, but the memory hasn't faded. I still see the ridge when I close my eyes. Still hear that slow pulse beneath the ground. Some sounds stay with you. Quiet but constant. I've served in other places since then. Places with clear orders and clear enemies. But that night was different. There was no fight, no victory, no failure. Only restraint. We were soldiers standing a few feet from something we couldn't name. And the hardest thing was to do nothing. People think courage means running toward danger. Sometimes it means standing still, keeping your word, holding your ground even when every part of you wants to move. That's the kind of courage most soldiers understand, the kind that no one writes medals for. I've learned that not every mission ends with noise. Some end in silence, and that silence asks more from you than fear ever could. If anyone wearing a uniform is hearing this, you already know. The desert keeps its secrets. Orders change, maps shift, and boundaries move. But what stays is that line inside you, the one you never cross. Hold it. Remember it. Because sometimes doing nothing is what keeps everything else standing. Don't turn off your lights yet. If you like the video, hit like and watch the next amazing horror story showing on your screen. The Appalachian Range stretches like an old scar across the eastern states. The land is rough, folded in long ridges and cut deep by rivers that seem to hide more than they reveal. In 1983, many towns in those valleys were shrinking. Coal jobs had vanished. Roads were cracked and forgotten. Some places still had signs from the 50s hanging over shuttered stores. Life there moved slow, except when it didn't. When our unit arrived that fall, the government called the region low priority. That meant few eyes watching. It was a good testing ground for field drills, radio experiments, and other tasks that stayed off the books. The fog made it ideal. It swallowed signal and sound. You could run exercises there, and the mountains would keep the secret. The weather that month was worse than forecast. Cold air from the north met warm streams from the south, trapping moisture in the hollows. The result was dense fog that stayed for days, sometimes weeks. Locals said it got inside your lungs. It changed how you saw distance, how you heard sound. There were stories about hunters getting lost a mile from their trucks, voices carrying wrong in the mist. You learned to wait for it to lift or you risk not coming back. We trained near the old mining corridor west of Black Hollow. The mines had closed in the 60s after a fire burned for 3 days underground. Even after 2 decades, the smell of smoke still came up from vents in the soil. It mixed with the damp and gave the air a sour taste. Some nights, the ground gave off thin ribbons of steam, pale against the darker fog. The locals said the fire still lived under the mountain. That setting did things to a man. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed on your chest. Nights went long. Sleep came light and ended early. By the second day, your mind started playing tricks. A tree stump looked like a crouched figure. A flash of light on wet stone felt like movement. You learned not to mention it because the others were seeing things too. Most of us were young. Hensley was 19. Corporal Duran was 21. The sergeant, whose name was Miller, had fought in Vietnam. He was older and quieter. He said the mountains here reminded him of places he wanted to forget. He kept his notes in a small green book. Later, that book became one of the few surviving records of what we saw. Supplies came by truck from a depot near Fort Bragg. Deliveries were often late. Radio contact faded without warning. The nearest town was 20 miles down a dirt road that washed out when it rained. Sometimes we would see lights on the ridge at night. They looked like lanterns moving slow, as if someone was walking a line above us. Miller said not to look too long. The locals stayed away from that part of the range. A man named Roy Tanner, who owned the gas station near the valley entrance, told us about the fog before we left. He said it wasn't natural. He claimed the miners used to hear voices before the fire. They said the mountain talked. When they ignored it, the ground caught flame. We laughed then, but on the third night, when the fog rose and the radio died, no one laughed anymore. That year, the Army had been running survival drills all across the eastern states. The Cold War still lingered. Everyone expected conflict to come from outside. No one looked inward. The Appalachians were an old frontier, older than most could imagine. There were stories buried under the soil and people living with ghosts of their own making. Each day in the fog felt longer than it should. The sun turned white, never breaking through. Our watches stopped working at the same time, then started again. Static crawled across the radio in steady pulses like a slow heartbeat. The pattern never repeated. We recorded it on a small tape that was later lost in storage. Miller kept track of every odd event. Temperature drops, compass errors, strange lights, he said. Write it down or you'll forget what's real. I still have one of his notes. It reads fog dense, sound carrying wrong. Hensley says he heard child's voice again. He underlined again. We thought fatigue explained it. Long hours, little sleep, constant damp. Our minds looked for patterns in the blur. But sometimes the fog moved before the wind did. Sometimes it rose up the slope against gravity. One night when it cleared for a moment, we saw something tall standing near the tree line. Not moving, not shaped like any man we knew. When we blinked, it was gone. That was the start of it. The line between duty and something else began to blur. No one spoke about fear, but it grew. We told ourselves the mountain played tricks. That explanation worked until one morning when one of us should have died and didn't. That event became the first case people later called deliverance. It began with a simple mistake. One man stepping off the path and meeting what we could never explain. And it became the reason some of us started to believe in what we call fog. The first case began on a gray morning in mid-October 1983. The date on Miller's notebook reads October 14th. The fog sat low over the ridge. It looked like a pale river running through trees. The ground was slick from dew. We moved in single file along an old logging cut. I was second in line. Private Jacob Hensley, 19 years old, walked point. He was small and quick, a kid from Pike County who knew the woods better than most. He wore a paracord bracelet that his sister had braided before he shipped out. He always touched it before stepping off. We were light on talk. Our breath showed in the cold and vanished. Every sound felt close. Water dripped from leaves. Somewhere above us, a woodpecker tapped the same slow beat again and again. The radios clicked like teeth. Then they fell quiet. Miller raised his hand and we stopped. A dead oak lay ahead across the cut. It was hollow in the center and black from an old burn. Hensley stepped up on the trunk. His boot slipped. He caught himself, laughed once, then moved on. He reached the far side and turned one hand up to signal all clear. The ground gave way under him. There was no cry at first, just the sound of dirt and stone sliding. The cut had hidden a sinkhole masked by leaf litter and a thin crust of soil. Hensley dropped straight down. I saw his face for a second, calm, almost blank. Then he was gone. The fog rolled over the hole and covered it like a lid. We ran. Miller dropped to his stomach and leaned over the edge. I crawled beside him. The hole sloped down into black. The walls were slick clay and roots. It smelled like old water and something sour, like a cellar that had been shut too long. We could hear Hensley breathing hard somewhere below. Then the rasp of his boots against clay. "Hold steady, Hensley," Miller said. "Do not move, I can't get a grip," Hensley answered. His voice was tight and small. "I am sliding." We formed a line and passed gear forward. Webbing, a coil of rope, a snap link. My hands shook and felt numb. I tied a bowline around my waist and clipped into the rope. Miller wrapped the other end around the fallen oak and braced it with his body. "I am going down," I said. Miller nodded once. "Go slow, talk to me all the way." The fog breathed in and out of the hole. It looked like it had a pulse. I went over the edge and felt cold climb up my legs. The clay stuck to my knees and wrists. I eased down inch by inch. Dirt slid under me and pattered into the dark. I could hear Hensley below. He was panting. He said something I could not catch. Then he said clear as if he was next to my ear, "There is a light." "What light?" I asked. "A light like a lantern. It is moving." I stopped. The hole swallowed my breath and gave it back as a wet echo. There was no light that I could see, only gray fog and black clay. My boot found a root. It bent under me. I shifted my weight and found another. The rope creaked. "How far?" Miller called. "Maybe 10 feet, I said. "I can hear him, I cannot see him." The rope slid a little. I locked my elbows and pushed back against the wall. My face was near the clay. It smelled like iron. I heard a small splash and then Hensley's voice again. "It is right in front of me," he said. "I can see a man holding it." "Do not move," I said. "Keep talking." "He is tall. He is wearing an old coat. He does not talk. He is pointing up." I felt the rope quiver. My mouth went dry. I looked down and saw nothing but dark. "Hensley," Miller said, voice steady, "stay where you are." "I am trying," Hensley said. "He is pointing up. He wants me to climb." "On my count," I said. 3, 2, 1, reach up." I lowered one loop of webbing. It hung in the fog like a snake. For a breath, I thought I saw a hand below it, thin and long. Then it was gone. The webbing swung. I let it down another foot. "I have it," Hensley said. "Clip in," I said. "We pull on my call." Miller grunted at the top. I felt the rope grow tight. The clay near my shoulder cracked and fell. Cold mud slid down my neck. I pushed my boots into the wall and pulled with my arms. The rope cut into my waist. My shoulders burned. "Pull," I called. We dragged. The rope scraped against the edge and sang. The fog poured into the hole and then rolled back. I kept my eyes on the gray blur below. It shifted like breath on glass. For a second it thinned. I saw Hensley. He was 10 feet down, 1 foot in the loop, one knee jammed into a root. His face was white with clay. His eyes were fixed on something beside me, not on me. "Do not look away," I said. "Do you see him?" he said. "No," I said. "Hold the rope." "He is right there," Hensley said. "He is looking at you." I said nothing. I could not see anyone. I could not hear anything but our own pulling. The rope jerked. My teeth hit hard and I tasted blood. We inched up. "Pull," I said again. It took time. I do not know how long. When we got him to the lip, Miller reached out and grabbed his jacket. The fabric tore. He caught Hensley's belt and hauled him over. We all fell back together. The fog rolled across us like a sheet. We lay there on the wet leaves. No one spoke. Hensley was shaking. He kept his eyes open like someone afraid of sleep. Miller sat up first and checked him over. No broken bones, scraped palms, one deep cut on his shin. The wound was clean and bled slow. He wrapped it with gauze and tape. "What did you see?" Miller asked. Hensley swallowed and touched his paracord bracelet. "A man," he said. "Tall, thin, a long coat like an old miner's coat. He held a lantern. He did not speak. He pointed up at the rope like he was telling me where to place my foot." "Did he touch you?" Miller asked. Hensley shook his head. "No," he stood back from the wall. The light made his face look wrong, like shadows drew lines where there were none. "Any sound?" I asked. "A whisper." He said, like something boiling, like wind in a pipe, not words. We moved camp after that. No one wanted to sleep near the sinkhole. The fog followed. It pushed through the trees in slow folds. It seemed thicker than before. The sun was a pale plate that never warmed us. That night Hensley woke shouting once. He said the lantern light had filled the tent. He said it turned everything gray. By morning he did not remember it clearly. He said it might have been a dream. None of us argued. We were too tired. At first light we went back to the sinkhole to mark it on the map for safety. We wanted to set a warning. The hole had changed. The walls had collapsed a little, leaving a shallow slope. In the mud near the bottom we found prints. Not boots, bare feet. They were narrow and long with toes splayed like someone who lived without shoes. Beside the prints, we found a ring of soot no larger than a dinner plate. It looked fresh, as if something had burned there for a few minutes and then died. Miller took photographs. He sketched the scene in his green book and wrote down our statements. He measured the prints with a ruler, 9 inches. He looked at the soot with a frown. He touched it with his finger and sniffed it. He said it smelled like old coal, not like wood. He did not say more. We checked our rope. It had a new stain halfway down, dark and greasy, that did not wash off in the creek. The outer fibers were singed in one small section. The edges curled tight as if held near heat. None of us had put it near fire. We filed our report when we got back to the assembly area at the base of the ridge. The radio log showed a gap of 7 minutes during the rescue. The watch on my wrist had stopped and then started at the same time. Hensley's camera had 3 frames of pale blur where the sinkhole should have been. Everything else on the roll was sharp. Some of that material went missing from the file later. The soot sample never reached the lab. The rope was replaced and lost from inventory, but the green book survived. So did our memories. Ask any of us who were there, and you will see the same look in the eyes. Not fear, not pride, just a quiet knowledge that something helped pull a 19-year-old out of a place where he should have died. Years later, a local paper ran a short piece about the old minefield near Black Hollow. It mentioned a foreman named Ezra Pike who died in 1963 while trying to lead men out after a collapse. A passerby told a reporter that Pike had been known for carrying a lantern with a blue glass shield. The details stuck with me. When I showed the clipping to Hensley, he stared at it for a long time and did not speak. Then he said, "The light was blue." I did not think to say it then. That was the first time I allowed for the idea that the mountain had rules we did not know. We had not earned a miracle. We had only been noticed. Maybe by a story that was not finished. Maybe by a man who never left. The fog held its silence. The account of that day, along with Miller's notes and the newspaper clipping, was recorded later by historian Linda Carver in 2006. After the incident at the sinkhole, Miller ordered a full rest day. We stayed near the creek and cleaned gear. The fog stayed low, thin as smoke, but constant. It moved between the trees like it knew where to go. No one talked much. The silence felt heavy, like we were waiting for something to happen again. Miller went through his notebook and checked every entry. He said we would write statements for record in case command asked. Hensley sat by the fire with a blanket over his shoulders. His eyes looked distant. When I asked how he felt, he said, "Like I left something down there." He meant it in a quiet way, not poetic, just a fact. We tried to explain it because soldiers need reasons. We said maybe methane gas rose from the mine fire and made him see lights. Maybe lack of oxygen caused hallucinations. The fog can twist sound, echo voices wrong, make light appear where it isn't. That is what Miller told command when he filed his report. But he wrote something different in his own notes. Possible visual interference from fog. Witness described human shape. Context unclear. Some of us talked about exhaustion. We had been running drills for weeks. Sleep came short. Food was dry. And our nerves were thin. When you push the body far enough, the mind starts filling blanks. You see what you expect to see. The doctors call it sensory substitution. It makes sense on paper, but there are limits. Hallucinations don't leave footprints or soot marks. They don't burn rope. There was another theory. Hensley's blood sugar had dropped. He had skipped breakfast that morning. A medic later said low glucose can cause vivid visions and loss of time. That sounded reasonable, too, until we remembered the watch stopping, the static pulse on the radio, the prints in the mud. Those things don't happen inside one man's head. When we rotated out 2 days later, an officer from the medical unit debriefed us. He asked if any of us had family history of psychosis. Miller said no. He asked if we had used any chemicals. Again, no. He wrote notes and looked bored. He said, "You boys were tired. The mountains play tricks. Happens all the time." Then he dismissed us. But something about his calm made it worse. It made you feel like maybe the mountain didn't want to be explained. Every theory made sense until you looked too close. Then something small broke. The facts didn't line up clean. Back at the barracks, Miller tried to run experiments. He burned different materials to compare soot patterns. None matched what we found. He shined lanterns through fog to see how light diffused. It never formed the same shape Hensley described. He wrote in his book, "Not hallucination, not weather, unknown." One night we gathered at the mess hall. The others asked what I thought it was. I said, maybe it was memory, maybe something left behind by the men who died in those mines. We walk over their graves and sometimes they look back. Hensley didn't speak. He just rubbed that paracord bracelet between his fingers. The human brain hates gaps. It builds bridges where the ground is missing. That is how we survive, so we built one too. We called it coincidence, gas, stress, trick of the light. We called it anything that made sense. But there was one thing we couldn't explain. The fog didn't behave like weather. It moved against wind charts. It stayed in the same valleys no matter the forecast. Command sent a small team later to measure humidity levels. Their report came back normal. They said no unusual gas emissions, no visual distortion beyond standard. Yet, one of their technicians wrote a note at the bottom. Observed optical reflection in fog at approximately 600. Source unidentified. The more we tried to reason it out, the more it slipped away. The mind looks for order. The mountain doesn't give it. You stand there long enough, you realize you are not meant to solve it. Still, Miller believed in keeping records. He said maybe one day someone smarter would connect it all. He wasn't wrong. Years later, a researcher named Dr. Ellen Fry reviewed our files. She called it a collective perception event. Her paper said, extreme stress combined with environmental anomalies can produce shared sensory phenomena. She closed with one question. If perception is shared, is it less real? That line stayed with me. We all saw the fog move. We all heard the voice. We all saw the prints. Maybe that was enough. Maybe reality is only what enough people agree they saw. We told ourselves we were fine. We finished the exercise. We went back to our posts. Life moved on, but something followed us down the mountain. In dreams, in long drives alone, in the quiet moments before dawn. A feeling that we had looked at something meant to stay unseen. 4 days passed. The fog changed a little, but the fear stayed the same. Then at dawn, when we reached the clearing, a new sign waited for us. The next time it showed itself, it didn't save anyone. It warned instead. That was when we learned what the locals meant by the dark sign. It started 4 nights after the sinkhole. We were ordered to move east along the ridge toward the next valley. The fog was thicker than ever. The air smelled of copper and rain that never came. The map showed a small clearing used as an old helipad in the 60s. That was our next checkpoint. We left camp at dawn. The light was pale and cold. It felt like we were walking underwater. Each man could see only the back of the next man's pack. No one spoke. The radios hissed now and then with short bursts of static, almost like whispers caught in metal. Miller led. I followed close. Hensley walked near the rear with Corporal Duran. We moved slow, checking bearings every few minutes. The compass needle jumped. It swung back and forth as if it couldn't decide which way north was. Around mid-morning, we reached the clearing. The ground was flat and open, ringed by black pines. The fog sat heavy, drifting in thin layers over the grass. Miller told us to rest. We dropped our packs and waited for the air to clear enough for a radio check. Then Duran said, "Do you see that?" He was pointing toward the far side of the clearing. At first I saw nothing. Then a shape began to form in the mist. It was darker than the fog around it. Tall, almost motionless. Not close, not far, just there. Miller lifted his binoculars. "Hold position," he said. We watched. The shape started to move. Slow at first, then steady. The fog parted around it like water around a stone. It looked like a man wearing a long coat, the same kind the miners used to wear. But there was something wrong about the way it moved. It didn't walk like a person. The steps were smooth, almost sliding. "Identify yourself," Miller called. His voice carried across the clearing. No answer. The shape stopped. It stood still. Then something bright flickered near its chest. A small glow like a red coal. "Fire?" I asked. Miller didn't answer. He raised his rifle slightly. "No weapons," he said after a pause. "We don't know what that is." The glow grew brighter, pulsing every few seconds. The fog thickened, curling in small rings around it. Duran muttered a prayer under his breath. Hensley whispered, "It's the same man." "The one from the hole?" I asked. He nodded, "But the light's wrong." The glow turned from red to white. It was harsh like a flare. It lit the fog from within and cast long shadows across the ground. The air grew colder. You could see our breath turn to frost. Then, as sudden as it came, the light snapped out. The figure vanished. The fog fell still again. We waited. The radio crackled. For a moment we thought it was command trying to reach us. But what came through wasn't a voice we knew. It was a short, broken sound, almost like someone drawing breath through water. Then a faint word, stretched and hollow. "Down." Miller froze. "Say again," he said into the radio. Static, then the same word, clearer this time. "Down." We looked around. The fog had changed color. It had gone darker, tinted with gray-green, the shade of old smoke. Duran stepped forward a few feet, scanning the ground. That was when the earth opened again, not wide, not deep, but enough. The ground under his boots gave way. He fell fast, one arm catching the edge. We rushed to grab him. I caught his wrist. His fingers were slick with mud. Miller shouted for rope, but Duran's eyes were not on us. He was staring at something below. His face went pale. "There's someone down here," he said. "Hold on," I said. "Don't look." He didn't listen. He leaned forward as if pulled by something. Then his expression changed. Fear, then calm. He whispered, "I see it." The rope came too late. His grip loosened for a second and his fingers brushed mine, then slipped free. He fell without a sound. The fog swallowed him. We called his name until our voices broke. The radio stayed silent. We waited for an hour, maybe two. The ground was too unstable to climb down. Miller marked the coordinates and called for extraction support, but no one answered. By nightfall, the fog lifted just enough to show the hole again. It was smaller now, half filled with dirt. The air smelled of sulfur. When we leaned close, there was no sign of Duran. Not a sound, not a print, nothing. Miller wrote it up as a collapse caused by erosion, but the ground there had been firm an hour before. He knew it. I knew it. Everyone did. That night we built no fire. We sat in a circle, rifles close, waiting for daylight. Around midnight, Hensley whispered, "Look." A faint light flickered in the distance, low to the ground, moving through the trees where the clearing had been. It was white, same as before. It drifted in slow circles. Then it stopped and rose straight up until it vanished into the clouds. No one spoke after that. The next morning, Miller took another set of photographs. None of them showed anything but fog. The negative from the frame where the light should have been came out overexposed. The film had burned through clean. Duran's body was never recovered. His name was added to the training accident list. The report said, "Ground instability, no foul play." That was the phrase they used when they wanted a story to disappear. A week later, when we reached the base, a letter came for Duran. It had been sent before the mission. Inside was a photograph of his family and a note written by his father. It said, "Be careful of the fog. The mountain keeps what it takes." The official version called it a landslide. We called it something else. A sign. The fog that had once saved now warned. It had changed color, changed meaning. The mountain had spoken again, and this time it asked for silence. Miller wrote in his notebook that night, "One saved, one taken. Same valley, same fog." He closed it and said nothing more. We broke camp the next day. None of us looked back. But from the truck through the trees, I saw a thin column of fog standing upright, unmoving, like a figure watching us leave. That was the last time we saw the clearing. Years later, when survey teams returned, the place had shifted. The ground was solid, no hole, no sign of collapse. But the GPS readings there always came out wrong, and the fog stayed thicker than anywhere else. The file still listed as an unresolved training loss, but we remember it as the night the fog took a man and gave no reason. After Duran vanished, something in the camp shifted. Orders kept us moving, but the air carried a quiet dread. We spoke less, slept less, and watched the fog like it could listen. Miller tried to keep discipline steady, but everyone felt it. You could sense a kind of waiting, like the mountain itself was breathing slow, watching us move through its ribs. We started talking about small things to keep our minds busy. Stories, habits, anything. Fear makes men reach for old beliefs. Hensley tied a strip of his torn jacket to a branch near camp. He said it was to mark the path, but I saw him touch it before turning in each night like a charm. Miller didn't stop him. He knew soldiers need their own kind of protection. In that part of the Appalachian, locals had their own ways. They left jars of salt near windows, carried iron nails in pockets, burned cedar to keep spirits quiet. Some miners used to leave their helmets upside down before entering a shaft. They said it tricked death into thinking they had already gone. We heard those things from Roy Tanner, the man at the gas station. At the time, they sounded like folklore. After Duran, they didn't. We started to copy them, small things at first, a nail in a boot, a circle of salt under the fire pit. None of us said why, we just did it. The fog still came each night, crawling in over the ridge, slow and deliberate. But it stopped short of the fire line now, as if respecting that thin circle of light. Miller began writing longer notes. He recorded temperatures, air readings, and radio signals. He logged the time the fog arrived and left. He also listed the names of men lost in older accidents nearby. We learned that 4 miners had died in 1963 during the same month as our mission, all near Black Hollow. Their bodies were never recovered. The report blamed toxic air. The fire underground had been burning since then, sealed but alive. The number struck me. 4 miners, then us. 4 left after Duran's fall. It felt like a balance we couldn't ignore. The Army called the mine fire a controlled hazard. Locals called it a grave that breathes. People said when the smoke rose thicker, it meant the mountain was hungry again. Miller dismissed it as talk, but I saw the way he glanced at the ridges whenever the smoke turned darker. We started hearing new things, too. At night, the static on the radio changed tone. It came in soft bursts, spaced like words. Once, just before dawn, we caught something clear enough to write down. 4 slow pulses, then 1 long tone. We checked Morse charts. The pattern matched the letter E it repeated 3 times before fatting. Nothing else. Hensley said maybe it meant end. None of us laughed. There were other moments, too. One morning, we found handprints on the inside of the tent flap, faint and gray, like soot rubbed into fabric. They were small, not full-sized, not a man's. We washed them off, but the stain came back when the fog returned that night. Belief is strange. It begins as a story, then turns into a habit, then becomes law. We stopped arguing about what was real. We cared more about staying alive. Miller told us to keep our watches clean, our boots dry, and our minds open. He said, "Sometimes you follow orders you can't explain." He started lighting a match before each patrol, just one. He'd hold it up, let it burn until his fingers almost touched the flame, then blow it out and nod. It wasn't regulation, but no one questioned him. That was his offering, or maybe his warning. The mountain stayed quiet for a few days after that. We thought maybe the storm of fog had passed, but it never really left. You could see it forming by afternoon, curling in valleys below, waiting for night. We sent our final situation report to command. The numbers were clean, equipment losses minor. 1 casualty listed as missing due to terrain failure, but Miller's private record showed more. It listed 6 equipment failures, 4 radio dropouts, and 12 unexplained fog movements. He noted possible magnetic interference. Then he added 1 line, underlined twice. Pattern repeating. That same week, the Army Archives in Fort Bragg logged 3 earlier reports from 1971 and 1978. Both described field teams encountering low-lying fog anomalies in the same grid square. One report mentioned visual contact with a humanoid silhouette emitting light. The writer, Captain Edwin Morris, was later reassigned. His report was sealed until 2004. The facts were there, but they didn't help. Knowing more only deepened the feeling that something ancient was woven into those hills, something that waited for men like us to pass through, to remind us that survival was a negotiation, not a right. By the end of that second week, sleep had turned thin again. Hensley said he dreamed of the same lantern man standing in the fog near the tent, face hidden by light. He said the man didn't speak, only raised his hand toward the ridge. Each time Hensley woke before seeing what he pointed to. The next morning he said quietly, "He's showing me where to go." None of us answered. The fog had begun to feel like a living thing, something we had angered without meaning to. Miller told him to rest, to keep calm, but we could tell he was worried. That night the fog came early. It rolled in thick before sundown. Miller's match went out before he could light it. The radio hissed with that same slow pulse, the one that spelled E. No one talked about belief anymore. We lived inside it. It was part of the air we breathed, part of the way we looked at the hills, part of the silence that followed each name we didn't say out loud. The fog had taken one of us and spared another. We had learned to mark the ground and speak soft, but deep down, we knew the pattern wasn't done. The man with the lantern wasn't finished showing us where the line ended. By the third week, the mountain had taken almost everything from us but the will to finish. The fog no longer surprised us. It came like a schedule, slow and sure. We built camp near the ridge's edge where the wind could touch us. Hopping it would keep the mist away. It didn't. That was when Hensley started writing. He used the back pages of Miller's spare notebook. At first, small notes, weather thoughts, random words, then longer lines that read more like farewells. He stopped eating much. He spoke less, but he didn't look afraid. He looked ready. One night he said quietly, "I think I'm next." Miller looked at him for a long time. "Don't say that," he said. "It isn't bad," Hensley said. "I keep seeing the man with the lantern. He isn't angry. He's waiting. Every time I close my eyes, he points to the same place." Miller asked where. "The old fire tower," Hensley said. "The one marked off limits on the map." We argued against going, but the next morning, Hensley packed his gear and said he needed to see it. Miller tried to order him to stay, but his voice lacked force. Maybe he knew something in his gut, too. Sometimes command breaks under silence, not noise. We followed anyway. The climb took hours. The fog thinned as we rose. For the first time in weeks, sunlight broke through, pale and tired. When we reached the tower, it stood crooked, metal rusted, and steps missing. The air smelled clean, almost sharp. Hensley looked around, calm as if he'd come home. He said he was right. This is the place. We waited while Miller checked the structure. The top platform leaned but held. He told us to stay below. Hensley ignored that. He started climbing. His boots hit each step slow and even. The wind moved through the frame, humming like low music. When he reached the top, he looked out toward the valley. For a while, he didn't speak. Then he said, "It's clear up here. I can see everything." Miller called up, "Stay focused. We head back soon." "I will," Hensley said, "but first I need to see him." The fog began to rise again from the valley floor. It moved fast, climbing the slope like water filling a bowl. It reached the tower base and started to curl around the legs. We shouted for Hensley to come down. He didn't move. He said one last thing, clear as if he stood beside us. "Don't follow this. Isn't for you." Then the fog swallowed the tower. We could hear the metal creak under weight, then nothing. When it cleared, the platform was empty. His rifle leaned against the rail. His notebook sat open near the edge, pages fluttering. No sign of him. We climbed up after, hearts pounding. The notebook held one line on the last page, written steady and clean. He showed me the way home. We searched for 2 days. No tracks, no fall marks, no trace. The report later said he went missing during a visibility event. The file used that phrase like it could make sense of what we saw. Miller never spoke of Hensley again. He packed the notebook, sealed it in a waterproof bag, and kept it with his own notes. Years later, when I saw him again, he still had it. He said sometimes he read that last line before sleep. He wasn't running, Miller said. He knew it was coming and he didn't fight it. There was nothing else to say. 3 men left the mountain. 2 never returned. The fog had drawn its line, taken its share. And somewhere in that quiet, something like peace came over what was left of us. Because once a man stops fearing what waits in the mist, the mountain has no power left to claim. When we came down from the mountain, the world felt too loud. Roads, voices, lights, all wrong. The fog had followed us for so long that clear air felt empty. Miller turned in our final report. It was thin, half the truth. The rest stayed buried in his green book. Command never asked more questions. 2 soldiers missing, one called a fall, one marked unknown. Paper closed it all, but we carried what paper couldn't. Years later, I read those reports again. I tried to line up the facts. One man saved by a light, one taken by it, one who followed it by choice. No pattern fits clean. Maybe it wasn't about saving or taking. Maybe it was showing. The fog was constant, but it changed its face. To Hensley, it was mercy. To Duran, warning. To the rest of us, reminder. We saw what we needed most in it. That's how belief works. It fills the space facts can't reach. Science said gas, weather, stress. Faith said spirit, curse, sign. Neither feels wrong. Both are only words we use to hide how small we are when something looks back at us. Miller died years later, heart failure in his sleep. His sister sent me his belongings. Inside the box was the green book. The last page had a single line in his handwriting. It always waited, we just learned to see it. I think about that often. Maybe the mountain wasn't haunted, maybe it was patient. The photographs, the maps, the radio tapes, they all fade. What stays is the feeling, the stillness before dawn, the sound of breath inside fog, the sense that something old still moves through those ridges, slow and unseen, watching. 3 names, 3 stories, 1 valley. You can call it weather or fate or nothing at all. Don't turn off your lights yet. If you like the video, hit like and watch the next amazing horror story showing on your screen.